Okay, I think so. Can you see me and hear me? I think I'm live. And can you hear me? Okay, cool. That was a little tech stuff to start off. Sorry about that. Hi, I'm David Corbett. This is a production for MWA NorCal. There are a number of brief little videos that we're going to be doing and posting here on Facebook concerning a number of subjects. Mine is about character, and in particular, I'm going to address villains. Yeah, and in particular, I want to talk about what I call moral argument, which is how the villain justifies what they do. Now, all characters have their own motivations, but what villains present as a particular problem, they're doing things that the rest of what we consider to be wrong, destructive, violent, evil. And what motivates a person to do that? And in general, there's like three separate categories. With the understanding these are not mutually exclusive, characters can operate under more than one of them, and they sometimes reflect one another. A character can not only have more than one, sometimes in the course of a story, they can actually progress from one to the other. And we'll talk about that a little bit as I go along. But the three major categories you have are power, wanting to either gain or maintain power. The second is revenge, or what you might call retributive justice, like getting even, or succeeding through getting even against people that you believe are holding you back, or against whom you believe you have a traditional grudge or argument. And the third is fear. Fear that if you don't cross these moral lines, something that you need very badly, some success that will ruin your life if you don't achieve, will be jeopardized. The fourth one is, I'm just going to bring this on, duty sometimes demands that a character do violent or illegal or even evil acts, but that usually they're acting with respect to one of the other factors. They're acting out of duty because they're afraid of what would happen if they don't follow orders, or it's duty to a cause that they believe is achieving them something that they want very badly. So duty is sort of a secondary aspect of this discussion, so we're going to leave that out for now and just focus on power, revenge, and fear. Now, power is one of the most interesting when you're constructing what you might call a supervillain or a very motivated and intelligent villain. You very often see psychopaths with a very elaborate, logical argument for why it's not just justified, but logical and necessary for them to do what they're doing. Start with a couple quotes that you might consider inspirational for this kind of villain. One is from Nietzsche, of course, everyone's favorite philosopher of evil. And the quote is, "Who can attain to anything great if he does not feel in himself the force and will to inflict great pain?" And the other one, which I love, is Shakespeare, of course, and this is from Richard III. "No beast so fierce, but knows some touch of pity. But I know none, and therefore am no beast." What you get from these is just a sense that great men focus on achieving great things. Lesser men worry about the consequences. The end justifies the means because the ends are always noble, great, even if they do or do not accept or recognize the fact that some of what makes the ends noble is itself ennobling. It makes them look better. They may know that, they may not care. They may just believe that they are a vehicle for great things. And whatever happens, it's just the necessity of achieving that greatness. Now, a couple examples. In Chinatown, Noah Cross, who's played by John Huston, at the end, when Jake is confronting him saying, why have you done all this? He's murdered Hollis Mulray, his one-time partner. and the head of the water department, who was defying Noah Cross's intentions to build a new dam. He's driven farmers off of their land and bought it cheap because he's deprived them of water. Why is he doing this? And his answer is the future, Mr. Gates, the future. Again, I am the one building this great thing that's coming about. You know, why should I be concerned with the moral details? The greatness justifies whatever I do. Another one is Ed Concannon in The Verdict, a wonderful script written by David Mamet. Paul Newman plays a lawyer who is suing the Archdiocese of Boston because a hospital that they run is responsible for putting a woman in a coma because the anesthesia during her operation was administered incorrectly. And he's looking to lose very badly. And his opposing counsel is Ed Concannon, who's played by James Mason. And as Concannon is paying Paul Newman's girlfriend for being an undercover informant for the diocese, he justifies what he's doing by saying, you know, we're not paid to give our best effort. We're paid to win. And whatever we need to do to achieve that is justified. Because of our winning, we are capable of doing incredible pro bono projects for the underprivileged and in representing the Archdiocese, which does so many good things for so many good people. So this is one of the classic justifications for doing violent, evil, destructive things, is that it's in the name of something great or noble. And if you're writing a villain like this, try to figure out what is the great thing, what is the future that they're trying to build. Now there's some interesting sort of transitional characters between this pursuing power and the next one, which is what I call revenge. One is Harry Lime from The Third Man, written by Graham Greene. He's played by Orson Welles in the film. And when he's being confronted by his best friend, as far as why he's doing what he's doing, and what he's doing is he's diluting penicillin intended for sick children in post-war Vienna and selling it on the black market, so that there's a real penicillin shortage in the hospitals, being replaced by diluted penicillin, which isn't working, and children are dying. And when his friend confronts him, Harry says, and this is just a classic justification, and again, it goes back to Nietzsche, don't be so gloomy. After all, it's not that awful. Like the fellow says, and the fellow is Nietzsche, in Italy for 30 years under the Borgias, they had warfare, terror, murder, and bloodshed. But they produced Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, and the Renaissance. In Switzerland, they had brotherly love. They had 500 years of democracy and peace. And what did that produce? The Cuckoo Clock. So it's unclear why Harry is doing such a demonic thing. I mean, basically, poisoning children. Probably greed. But is that enough to justify it? But he certainly justifies it to himself by saying, well, look, nothing is ever achieved in peace. It's always achieved in turmoil, in chaos. Now that seems like kind of a cheap rule, but let's take it to a new level with another villain who uses a very similar argument, and that's the Joker in Dark Knight, the film that was made by Jonathan and Christopher Nolan, and Heath Ledger played the Joker. He considered himself an agent of chaos. And really one of the most memorable lines in the film, he says, and the truth about chaos is fair. That's just a devastating insight into an ability to justify terrible things in the name of, well, truth matter is, that's far fairer than government order, police-inflicted law and order. Chaos is fair. But he also justifies his acts on the fact that the truth of the matter is, Batman is supposedly standing up for the little guy, but the little guy doesn't have any strong moral bearing. As soon as things don't go according to plan, he's going to turn on Batman in a heartbeat. And then the Joker says, I'm not evil, I'm just ahead of the curve. But also his whole persona is in a certain sense a form of moral argument. And when I read this quote from Melville, I thought, if this wasn't the inspiration for the Joker, it certainly could have been. There are certain queer times and occasions in this strange mixed affair we call life, when a man takes this whole universe for a vast practical joke, though the wit thereof he but dimly discerns, and more than suspects that the joke is at nobody's expense but his own. The Joker, seeing the meaninglessness of life from his perspective, the utter lack of any notion of why life is worthwhile, has turned that saying, well, the universe is playing a joke on us, and I will personify that joke. And that's why I think he's one of the most fascinating villains in the genre. He has a great moral argument. And you talk about cartoonish, yeah, he's a cartoonish villain, but it's pushed to a really fascinating extreme. Okay. Now, another thing that to take into consideration here is you do want to avoid thinking of your villains as psychopaths or narcissists or some other term, because you can wind up just creating a plot puppet in psychobabble drag. Remember, you always have to justify, not judge, all your characters, and especially your villains, because it's so easy to stand outside them and judge them instead of getting under their skin and seeing things from their point of view. We all know the old saw, that the villain is the hero of his own narrative, and it's important to get into his skin in a fundamental way. And this is what this whole moral argument is about. How does he argue the legitimacy of what he's doing? So psychopath doesn't really help you. But I do want to discuss at least a little bit the difference between a psychopath and a sociopath. A psychopath is almost always driven by a sense of individual gain. A lot of psychopaths are actually quite successful. They don't want to commit crime because it would undermine their drive to succeed individually. You find a lot of them surgeons, you find them on Wall Street, you find them in the law, you find them in politics. So psychopaths aren't necessarily evil, but they are driven by an extreme self-interest. Sociopaths have what's usually referred to as a kind of defiant individualism. And this was a term that was brought up by a sociologist named Martin Sanchez Jankowski in his book, Islands in the Street, Gangs in American Urban Society. And his point was, young men join gangs because it will intensify their ability to pursue their self-interest in an environment which is hostile, impoverished, and in which they are usually, if they're alone, are in jeopardy. Whereas in a gang, there's mutual interest that can protect them. So very often gangs have an actual moral code that you're expected to follow. For example, you don't kill members of the gang, but outsiders are fair game. Sometimes you don't want to kill cops or civilians either because that just intensifies scrutiny of the gang. But opposing gangs, fair game. One of the most famous examples of this are the Chechenskaya, the Chechen Brotherhood. They were a sort of a Robin Hood group of gangsters who typically targeted wealthy Russians. The animosity between Russia and Chechnya is part of this whole dynamic. And they were notorious for the extreme violence, but also for the sort of bonds within the group. Similar to this, you hear, in organized crime, the whole notion of omerta, although that's been disproven as Charlie, what's Charlie's last name? God help me. Charlie Stella made a point of saying in his books, nobody flips faster than a wise guy. So that whole notion of group loyalty isn't quite as sacrosanct as it used to be. However, in most gangs, there is a sense of solidarity within, and as a result, a sort of moral code within that. Terrorists very often have a similar code. Sarah Kershaw was a researcher, and she noted that after they began being able to interview individual terrorists and talk to them about their motivations and why they were willing to strap on a suicide vest or do some other destructive act, they noticed a certain pattern of tenets that they held on to. One was a generational transmission of extremist beliefs, which begins early in life. These things are passed on from grandfather to son, uncles and cousins. There's a family culture that justifies the belief system. There is a strong sense of victimization and alienation. We're the victims. We are being iced out of power and prosperity by this powerful enemy. There's a belief that moral violations by the enemy justify violence in pursuit of a higher moral condition. Now, this has echoes of the craving of power that we discussed first. Not only do they feel victim, but they realize that their actions are justified because they have a higher moral purpose. And finally, there's a belief that the terrorist's ethnic, religious, or nationalist group is special and in danger of extinction, and that they currently lack the political power to effect change without violence. Now, that's also similar to how organized crime, especially Italian organized crime or Irish organized crime in the United States, justified itself. We're a minority. We've got a gun to our head. People are trying to keep us down. If we don't bond together, and if we aren't willing to do whatever it takes to rise us up and the people around us, we're going to get crushed. So the terrorist mindset and the organized crime mindset, as well as the gang mindset, share a certain resonance. And so if you're going to have characters who act within that system, one thing you're going to really have to understand is, why do they feel oppressed? Who is doing the oppressing? Who are they lashing out at? What is the higher moral condition they're trying to achieve? And how does that justify whatever violence or criminality they're intending to commit? Okay? Now, I'm just checking the time to make sure I don't go over here, because I've only got 20 to 30 minutes, so this is a really short lecture for the kinds of things I usually like to talk about. Anywho, so the next one, that we've just discussed power, either gaining or maintaining power. We've seen some sort of marginal, moving from sort of retributive justice, our group is being oppressed, so we need to do whatever we can to turn that about, which is to gain power. Now let's look at just pure revenge or retributive justice. There is a quote from Jimmy Santiago Baca in his prison memoir, A Place to Stand, which I think really speaks to this really, really well. He says, the rage that came out of him, this is a fellow inmate that he's describing, the rage that came out of him was the kind of rage that can only be created in prison. The seeds of that rage are nourished by prison brutality and fertilized by fear and the law of survival of the fittest. It grows and grows, hidden deep in souls that have died from too many beatings, too many jail cells, and bottomless despair, contained like a ticking bomb. And this kind of firestorm wrath, once a man has it in him, that man, when the rage comes out, becomes a god. Now, I have taught in prison, and we've discussed this, and it's a really common theme, even among guys who have turned the corner and are seeking to do good once they get out. They understand what it's like to believe that, okay, I get why I deserve to be punished, and I have accepted that punishment, and I've turned myself around, only to be told, oh, dude, you've got 15, 20 more years of just sitting here because we have the power. It can turn you extremely bitter. Now, Baca says that in the context of prison, but it isn't just prison that produces that kind of mindset. So does extreme abuse um, being a child in a refugee camp, um, repeated sexual abuse, rape. These can all create a mindset where the individual feels so vulnerable